Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the final years of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire was a ghost of its former self. Once ruling over half the known world, it now clung desperately to the last fragments of its colonial possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. These islands were all that remained of a global dominion that had once stretched from Mexico to Manila. In the eyes of the world, Spain was a fated empire, proud, impoverished, and brittle. But to the people it still ruled, the fires of rebellion had never truly gone out. Cuba, the so-called Pearl of the Antilles, had long been both jewel and prison. Its sugar fields fueled Spain's economy, while its people simmered under colonial oppression. For decades, cries for independence had been met with repression. The first great uprising, known as the 10 Years' War, began in 1868, led by Cuban landowners and revolutionaries who declared freedom from Madrid's control. It failed after a decade of bloodshed, leaving the island scarred and divided. But the dream of liberation did not die. By 1895, Cuba was once again aflame. Rebel leader José Martí, poet and martyr, had reignited the revolution before falling in battle, his death transforming him into a national symbol. Bands of Cuban insurgents, known as Mambises, swept through the countryside, attacking plantations and rail lines, drawing Spain into a costly counterinsurgency. The empire answered with fire and steel. Villages were torched, civilians displaced, and thousands herded into camps. Across the Florida Straits, the United States watched with both sympathy and suspicion. The American press reported daily on the chaos in Cuba, often with headlines exaggerated to provoke outrage. U.S. investors had millions tied up in Cuban sugar and tobacco, while moralists and politicians spoke of liberating the oppressed. Yet beneath the rhetoric of compassion lay something more pragmatic: the lure of power. For decades, Washington had seen Cuba as a natural sphere of influence. The island sat just 90 miles off its coast, close enough to tempt, close enough to threaten. Officially, America remained neutral. President Grover Cleveland declared that the United States would not interfere in the quarrels of another nation. But neutrality proved fragile when set against the rising tide of public sentiment. Newspapers, led by men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, began to paint the conflict not as a colonial rebellion, but as a moral crusade: the innocent Cubans against the cruel Spaniards. Sensational tales of villages burned and children starved flooded the pages, each headline designed to ignite emotion, outrage, and ultimately, action. For many Americans, Cuba's struggle began to mirror their own revolution against Britain. The same words, liberty, tyranny, freedom, echoed across generations. Public opinion swelled, turning pity into pressure. Across Havana, Spanish soldiers stood guard behind sandbags while smoke rose from the hills beyond. In Washington, debates sharpened. Was intervention an act of mercy or ambition? As the tension deepened, the streets of Havana grew uneasy, and an American warship, USS Maine, began its quiet voyage south, sent to protect American citizens. No one aboard could know that their arrival would soon light the fuse of an empire's final war. When the Cuban Rebellion reignited in 1895, it didn't stay confined to the Caribbean. Across the sea, in bustling American cities, the news of Spanish atrocities began seeping into parlors and newspapers. But it wasn't the cold reports of diplomats that stirred the nation. It was the fevered ink of the press. This was the age of yellow journalism, when headlines screamed louder than truth, and emotion became the most powerful weapon of persuasion. Two titans of publishing, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, competed fiercely for readers. Their newspapers, the New York Journal and the World, transformed distant suffering into moral spectacle. Pages were filled with lurid sketches of Spanish cruelty: women imprisoned, children starved, villages burned. Cuba's cry for freedom became a recurring banner. Facts were often stretched or invented, but accuracy mattered less than impact. Hearst himself famously told an illustrator in Havana, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Whether he truly said it or not, the line captured the spirit of the moment: journalism as a spark to ignite nations. public opinion swayed dramatically. Church leaders denounced Spain from pulpits. Civic clubs held rallies calling for intervention. Young men wrote to Congress demanding action, while mothers donated money for Cuban relief. To millions, the rebellion had taken on a sacred tone, a struggle of light versus darkness, liberty versus tyranny. And yet, behind that moral fervor, another current was forming, one of ambition and opportunity. By the 1890s, the United States had emerged as a rising industrial giant. Factories boomed, railroads stretched across the continent, and now the nation's gaze turned outward. Politicians and businessmen began to speak of America's manifest destiny, not just across the plains, but across the oceans. The Atlantic was no longer a boundary, it was a bridge. To them, Cuba represented not merely a cause, but a stepping stone, a potential naval base, a gateway to the Caribbean, a projection of power. Still, the U.S. government hesitated. President Grover Cleveland, wary of imperial entanglements, warned that the American Republic must not assume the role of the world's policeman. But each week, reports from Havana grew more graphic, the headlines more urgent. The Spanish Governor-General, Valeriano Weyler, soon to be dubbed the Butcher, began enforcing a ruthless policy to break the insurgency. And with it, he would break any illusion of peace. Across America, the tone shifted from sympathy to fury. The war of words was becoming something more dangerous, a war of conscience. The people were ready to fight for Cuba's freedom, or so they believed. When Spain sent General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba in 1896, it did so with one desperate objective: to crush the rebellion once and for all. Weyler was no ordinary soldier. He was disciplined, unflinching, and utterly convinced that fear was more effective than mercy. His orders were simple: pacify the island no matter the cost. To Madrid, he was a loyal servant. To Cuba, he would soon become a symbol of terror. Weyler's campaign began with cold precision. He divided Cuba into military zones, built blockhouses and trenches, and ordered civilians to abandon the countryside. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were torched. Families were herded into barbed wire enclosures known as reconcentration camps. The logic was brutal. If the rebels had no civilians to feed or shelter them, they would starve. But what began as strategy became catastrophe. Within months, the camps overflowed with the sick and hungry. Food was scarce, disease rampant. By some estimates, over 200,000 Cubans would perish from starvation and illness before the year's end. In the American press, Weyler became the Butcher. His name was paired with sketches of skeletal prisoners and mothers clutching dead infants. Hearst and Pulitzer's newspapers ran headlines that dripped with outrage. Women slain in the name of Spain. Cuba's fields of death. The stories were sometimes exaggerated, but the misery was real enough to fuel a fire no government could contain. In Washington, officials received conflicting reports. Some diplomats urged caution, warning that the situation, though tragic, was still Spain's internal affair. Others, especially those with economic or strategic interests, argued that America's moral duty demanded intervention. The image of a civilized republic standing idle while atrocities unfolded just 90 miles away became politically intolerable. Even ordinary Americans who once saw foreign wars as Europe's burden began to view Cuba's suffering as a test of national character. Churches collected donations for refugees. Veterans of the Civil War volunteered for service should their country decide to act. If liberty means anything, one senator declared, it must mean liberty for the oppressed. But beneath those noble words, the reality was murkier, because America's interest in Cuba had long been more than humanitarian. For decades, American businessmen had invested heavily in Cuba's sugar and tobacco plantations. U.S. trade with the island exceeded that of Spain itself, and in the shadow of idealism, expansionist voices whispered of opportunity, that America, the new industrial titan, might now step into the void of empire Spain had left behind. As 1897 began, the pressure on Washington grew unbearable. President Cleveland's successor, William McKinley, inherited not only the Cuban crisis, but a public ready for war. Still, McKinley hesitated. The former Union soldier who had seen the carnage of battle was reluctant to send young men to fight abroad. Yet even his patience had limits. Then came the letter. A private correspondence from Spain's ambassador in Washington, mocking McKinley as weak and cowardly, found its way into the press. The Delhomme letter, as it became known, exploded like a diplomatic bombshell. America's honor had been insulted, and the calls for war became deafening. But fate had one more spark to deliver, a tragedy that would shatter any hope of restraint. In February 1898, as Havana simmered under rebellion, a single letter crossed the Atlantic, a message that would inflame a nation's pride. Written by Enrique Dupuy Delhomme, the Spanish ambassador to Washington, it was meant for private eyes only. In it, he described President William McKinley as weak and catering to the rabble, a politician with the backbone of a chocolate eclair. It was a careless insult, but one that would carry the weight of war. When Cuban revolutionaries intercepted the letter and passed it to the American press, the New York Journal published it in full. The headlines were explosive. Across the United States, readers gaped in outrage. To insult the president was to insult the nation. The timing could not have been worse. Relations between Washington and Madrid were already fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. Within days, Delhomme was forced to resign and return to Spain, his career ruined, but the damage was done. The American public, already inflamed by months of sensational reports from Cuba, now saw the insult as proof of Spanish arrogance and duplicity. President McKinley tried to calm the storm. He sought compromise, not conflict, believing that careful diplomacy might still secure Cuban peace without bloodshed. Yet his moderation appeared weak to many. To the public, each day of hesitation looked like cowardice, each conciliatory gesture, betrayal. Senators thundered in Congress that America's honor had been spat upon. Newspapers blared demands for justice and vengeance. It was in this tense, volatile atmosphere that the USS Maine, an American battleship, entered Havana Harbor. Officially, it was there on a friendly visit, to protect American citizens and property during the unrest. But everyone understood its true purpose. The Maine was a message, a steel declaration of presence. Beneath its decks, 354 crewmen settled into their bunks, unaware that they had become part of a grand and dangerous theater. Night fell over Havana on February 15th, 1898. The air was still, the harbor quiet. Only the soft creak of ships and the murmur of soldiers on the quay. At 9:40 p.m., without warning, a colossal explosion tore through the Maine. A flash of white light split the darkness, followed by a roar that shook the city. The ship's forward magazines detonated, sending steel and flame into the sky. Within minutes, the proud vessel lay broken, half submerged, its decks twisted like paper. 266 sailors perished in the blast. In Washington, the news struck like thunder. No one knew what had caused the explosion. An accident, perhaps, or a mine beneath the hull. But the truth no longer mattered. The public had already chosen the culprit. "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" became the rallying cry that echoed from coast to coast. Newspapers printed illustrations of the ship's wreckage surrounded by phantom Spanish saboteurs. The outrage was total, patriotic, emotional, and unstoppable. President McKinley ordered an investigation, hoping for restraint. Yet even as his inquiry began, Congress was preparing for war. Across the country, volunteers enlisted by the thousands, flags flew from city halls, and sermons declared divine justice. The press that had once fanned curiosity now fanned fury. America, a nation barely 3 decades removed from its own civil war, was once again preparing for battle, this time on foreign shores. And in Havana's quiet harbor, the shattered Maine rested beneath the water, a grave, a warning, and a beginning. The wreck of the USS Maine became an altar of fury. In the weeks after the explosion, crowds gathered in every American city, waving flags and singing patriotic hymns beneath banners demanding vengeance. Newspapers printed the dead sailors' faces beside illustrations of Spanish mines and shadowy divers, none of it proven, all of it persuasive. The facts had drowned in Havana Harbor, but the emotion had not. A U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry was convened to find the cause. After a month of investigation, it reported that an external mine had triggered the blast, but offered no evidence of who planted it. Spain's own inquiry insisted the explosion came from inside the ship, perhaps a malfunctioning boiler. Yet in the public imagination, the verdict had already been rendered. Spain had murdered American sailors in their sleep. Truth was irrelevant. What mattered was outrage. President William McKinley, once cautious to a fault, now faced a nation ablaze with anger. Senators bellowed in Congress that honor demands war. Veterans of the Civil War, now gray and stooped, volunteered again to finish one more fight. Even school children sent pennies to fund rifles and flags. McKinley, deeply reluctant, sought one final diplomatic path, demanding Spain grant Cuba its independence. Madrid refused. The die was cast. On April 25, 1898, the United States formally declared war on Spain. Church bells rang across the country as people poured into the streets, convinced they were embarking on a crusade for freedom. Few questioned the deeper motives: markets, naval bases, and national pride hidden behind the noble banner of liberation. Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, pledging that the U.S. had no intention of annexing Cuba. It sounded moral, almost chivalric, but history would soon prove otherwise. As regiments drilled on the training grounds and shipyards thundered with activity, the war's first moves were already being set in motion far from Cuba's shores. Thousands of miles to the west, in the calm waters of the Pacific, an American fleet waited quietly for orders. Its commander a calm, sharp-eyed man who would, within days, end centuries of Spanish rule in Asia. Before the first shot was ever fired in the Caribbean, the first victory of the war would belong to him. In Washington, war had begun to feel inevitable long before the declaration. For months, President William McKinley tried to balance diplomacy with dignity, pleading for patience while the press demanded blood. Behind closed doors, he agonized over every decision, haunted by memories of the Civil War he had fought in as a young man. "I have seen the dead piled up," he said quietly to a friend. "I do not want to see that again." But history does not always obey conscience. Congress was swept by a tide of nationalism that no speech could restrain. The sinking of the Maine had fused moral outrage with patriotic fervor, and politicians knew the will of the people. The Teller Amendment, assuring the world that America sought to free Cuba, not rule it, passed overwhelmingly. It sounded like a noble promise. Yet few could ignore the irony that the same Congress was already eyeing Spanish colonies beyond the Caribbean. When the declaration of war was signed on April 25, 1898, the United States had barely any combat experience outside its borders. Its army was small, scattered, and ill-equipped. Many officers still carried swords from the Civil War era, and logistics were a nightmare. Uniforms rotted in southern warehouses, and rations meant for troops often spoiled before reaching the front. But what the Army lacked in organization, the Navy more than compensated for in confidence. The U.S. Navy of 1898 was young, modern, and hungry for glory. Steel warships with massive guns now replaced the wooden fleets of the past. One of these new vessels, the Olympia, was flagship of the Asiatic Squadron, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, a man known for his composure and ruthless efficiency. In late April, as diplomatic cables still fluttered between Washington and Madrid, Dewey received a secret order from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands. Capture or destroy the Spanish fleet. It was a daring move, an attack on the opposite side of the world, in a theater no one expected. But Roosevelt understood something crucial. To cripple Spain, America had to strike its empire, not just its armies. Dewey prepared his fleet in Hong Kong and awaited the final signal. By the time McKinley's formal declaration of war reached him, his ships were already steaming toward the Philippines. On the first morning of May, as dawn broke over Manila Bay, the calm waters shimmered under rising light. Spanish lookouts spotted the dark silhouettes of American warships approaching silently from the sea. Dewey turned to his gunnery officer and gave the calmest order in naval history. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Within minutes, history would pivot. Not in Havana, but in Manila. The sea was still and golden when the American squadron slipped into Manila Bay before dawn on May 1, 1898. 6 U.S. warships, led by Commodore George Dewey aboard the Olympia, glided silently past the Spanish coastal batteries guarding the entrance. The gunners above never fired a shot. Some were asleep, others too shocked to act. Behind the hills, the city of Manila still dreamed, unaware that 3 centuries of Spanish rule were about to end in a morning. At 5:40 a.m., as the first sunlight broke through the mist, Dewey gave his famous order, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The Olympia's great guns answered with thunder. Within minutes, the Spanish fleet under Admiral Patricio Montojo was engulfed in smoke and flame. One by one, their wooden ships exploded or ran aground, unable to match the range and firepower of America's modern steel navy. For hours, the bay echoed with cannon fire. But the result was never in doubt. The Spanish shells splashed harmlessly into the sea, while American volleys found their marks with brutal precision. By mid-morning, Dewey halted the bombardment, ordered breakfast for his men, and calmly reviewed the damage. Not a single American ship had been sunk. Not one sailor had been killed in combat. When the guns roared again later that morning, it was only to finish what had already been decided. By early afternoon, the Spanish fleet was annihilated, 11 ships destroyed, more than 300 men dead. The smoke drifted toward the city as silence returned to the bay. It was, as one British observer remarked, the end of an empire in 2 hours. Dewey's victory stunned the world. It was the first major naval battle of the war, and it had been fought 7,000 miles from Cuba, where the conflict had supposedly begun. Newspapers in America erupted in triumph. "Dewey smashes Spain," proclaimed headlines coast to coast. The calm, gray-eyed Commodore was instantly transformed into a national hero. Yet, for all his success, Dewey faced a problem. His fleet had destroyed the enemy, but he lacked the troops to occupy Manila itself. The city was still held by Spanish forces, while Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo surrounded it on land. These rebels, who had fought Spain for years, now saw the Americans as liberators, allies in the final blow against colonial rule. But Dewey's silence when they asked for recognition spoke volumes. For now, both sides tolerated the illusion of friendship. Aguinaldo's men fought to encircle Manila, and Dewey's ships kept Spanish reinforcements from arriving. It was an uneasy alliance built on necessity, not trust. The Filipino leader hoped the Americans would honor their talk of liberty. The Americans, quietly, were already thinking about what would come after Spain was gone. As the sun set over Manila Bay, the U.S. flag fluttered above a fleet of victorious ships. The ocean was calm again, but the currents beneath were shifting. A new kind of empire was awakening, one that spoke the language of freedom while learning the habits of power. In the smoldering aftermath of Manila Bay, the Philippines stood between 2 revolutions, one fading, one just beginning. The Spanish colonial order was collapsing, but what would replace it was far from certain. As the Spanish garrisons retreated inland, the Filipino rebels who had fought for decades under the banner of independence surged forward with renewed hope. Their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, returned from exile under an understanding or illusion that the Americans had come as partners in liberation. Aguinaldo was just 29, charismatic, ambitious, and utterly convinced that destiny was on his side. To him, Dewey's victory was the long-awaited miracle. Spain's naval power shattered, its army isolated, its empire in Asia bleeding out. He quickly rallied tens of thousands of Filipino revolutionaries, surrounding Manila from the countryside, blockading roads, and cutting Spanish supply lines. From his headquarters, Aguinaldo proclaimed a new Philippine Republic, drawing up a constitution and promising freedom after 3 centuries of colonial rule. On the decks of his flagship, Commodore Dewey watched the revolution unfold with quiet calculation. His orders were simple: destroy Spain's fleet, hold Manila, await further instructions. But the ground was shifting faster than Washington's diplomats could respond. In the villages around Manila, 2 flags flew: the red and blue sunburst of the Filipinos and the stars and stripes of the Americans. Allies for now, but their goals were not the same. Dewey met with Aguinaldo, offered polite words of encouragement, yet avoided any binding promises. The Americans spoke often of helping the Filipinos, but their correspondence with Washington betrayed a different tone. The islands were too strategic, too rich in resources to simply walk away from. A deep-water port in Manila meant control of the Pacific. To many in the U.S. Navy, The Philippines was not a temporary stop. It was the gateway to Asia. Meanwhile, in the streets of Manila, tension simmered. Spanish officers still occupied the city's walled center, surrounded by rebels who now outnumbered them 10-1. Yet the Americans refused to let Aguinaldo's forces enter. It was not Filipino soldiers who would claim the capital. That privilege, Dewey insisted, belonged to the United States. The revolutionaries were stunned, but they held their ground. Letters from the front described the strange stalemate. The Spaniards watch us from their ramparts, the Americans watch us from their ships. We, who fought for freedom, are told to wait. But waiting was dangerous. Washington had dispatched reinforcements, an expeditionary army under General Wesley Merritt, 15,000 strong. Their mission, to take Manila, not to share it. In July 1898, as American transports arrived in the bay, Dewey and Merritt began to plot what history would later call the mock Battle of Manila. The Spanish, broken and exhausted, were ready to surrender, but only to the Americans, never to the rebels who had once been their subjects. The war for independence, it seemed, was being rewritten in real time. What began as a crusade for freedom was slowly becoming something else, a struggle for control. And on the horizon, the guns of empire were beginning to turn, not against Spain, but against its would-be heirs. By August 1898, the Spanish garrison in Manila was starving, demoralized, and surrounded. For weeks, they had endured a siege between two armies, the Filipino revolutionaries encircling them on land, and the U.S. fleet blockading them from the sea. Every day, the soldiers inside the city watched the horizon darken with American ships and the countryside flicker with rebel campfires. There was no escape, no reinforcement, and little honor left to lose. Spain's centuries-old empire in Asia had been reduced to this: one besieged colonial capital, and a question of who would claim it. In Washington, American diplomats had begun quiet negotiations with Madrid, but the situation in Manila was more immediate. Commodore George Dewey and General Wesley Merritt, commanding the newly arrived U.S. Army expedition, agreed on a peculiar plan. The Spanish governor, realizing the futility of resistance, signaled that he would surrender, but only to the Americans. Spain refused to hand the city to the Filipino rebels who had fought and died for its liberation. And so, a secret understanding was reached. A mock battle would be staged to allow Spain to yield the city with dignity, and to ensure that American forces, not Filipinos, would occupy Manila. On the morning of August 13, 1898, the guns of Dewey's fleet opened fire on the city's outer defenses. But their aim was deliberately wide. Spanish batteries responded with token volleys, hitting nothing. As smoke filled the air, U.S. troops advanced cautiously toward Manila's walls, while Filipino fighters, expecting to storm the city alongside their allies, were ordered to hold back. Confused and betrayed, they watched from the outskirts as the Americans marched forward. By noon, a white flag rose above Fort San Antonio de Abad. The Spanish governor surrendered to General Merritt in what witnesses later described as a performance staged for the cameras of history. Not a single American had been killed in the final assault. Dewey and Merritt entered the city in triumph, greeted by polite, weary Spanish officers. The American flag was raised over Manila, and the U.S. military proclaimed the city under its authority. The Filipino revolutionaries, barred from entering, were left standing outside the gates. The victors denied their victory. They had believed the United States had come to grant freedom. Instead, they watched as one empire's flag replaced another's. "We have been sold," Aguinaldo murmured bitterly. That night, as American troops patrolled Manila's cobblestone streets and Spanish prisoners stacked their rifles, the uneasy silence of betrayal settled over the islands. Across the Pacific, American newspapers celebrated the victory as another step in the march of progress. "Manila falls! Liberty triumphant!" blared the headlines. But beneath the triumph, something darker had begun. In the months to come, the Philippines would no longer be a battlefield between Spain and America, but between Americans and Filipinos, the very people who had once cheered them as liberators. For now, however, the war's center of gravity was shifting back across the world, to the Caribbean, where the true heart of the Spanish Empire's last stand awaited. Cuba still burned, and Guantanamo Bay would soon become the next name etched into the ledger of war. While Manila burned on the far side of the world, another front erupted closer to home. In June 1898, the United States turned its full attention to the Caribbean, to the island that had started it all, Cuba. Here, the war's promises were personal. America had gone to battle, it claimed, to free this land from tyranny. But the fight would begin not in Havana or Santiago, but in a small hidden harbor on the island's southern coast, Guantanamo Bay. The bay was a crescent of deep blue water surrounded by rocky hills and mangrove thickets, perfect for a naval foothold. The U.S. command knew that whoever controlled Guantanamo would control the sea routes to Santiago, Spain's main stronghold. On June 6th, under cover of darkness, a small American flotilla slipped into the bay. Aboard the ships were 600 Marines, the first U.S., ground troops to land in Cuba, supported by a few hundred Cuban rebel fighters who had long fought the Spanish from the hills. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The Spanish garrison, nearly 5,000 infantrymen supported by artillery batteries, opened fire from the shore. The Americans returned fire from the decks of their cruisers and gunboats, lighting the coastline with flashes of orange and thunder. The Marines came ashore through knee-deep surf, carrying rifles, shovels, and the heavy burden of expectation. They were told the war would be brief, glorious, a mere show of strength. What they found was a tangle of heat, thirst, and sudden death. The fighting at Guantanamo was chaotic and brutal. Spanish snipers hid in the brush. The sun turned the hills into ovens. The Americans, unused to the terrain, fought not just the enemy, but the land itself. Scorpions, heat stroke, and disease claimed nearly as many as the bullets. One Marine recorded in his diary, "Every step is a struggle, every hill takes blood." Yet slowly, methodically, they advanced. On the second day, U.S. sailors cut the undersea telegraph cables, severing Spain's communications. Deprived of coordination, the defenders faltered. Small skirmishes turned into scattered retreats. Cuban rebel guides led the Marines through ravines toward Spanish blockhouses, where bayonets and grenades finished what artillery began. By June 10th, after 4 days of savage fighting, the Spanish forces abandoned Guantanamo Bay entirely. The Americans had won, their first victory on Cuban soil. The cost was steep, but symbolic. Guantanamo became the first permanent American foothold in Cuba, and it would remain so long after the war ended. In the jubilant headlines that followed, the battle was hailed as proof of America's courage and destiny. Yet for the men who had fought there, the victory was anything but glorious. The corpses of comrades lay unburied in the sun. The stench of decay filled the air. One Marine wrote home, "If this is the price of empire, may it not grow too great." But the war was far from over. Beyond the green hills of Guantanamo, the Spanish still held Santiago de Cuba, defended by entrenched troops and guarded by an entire fleet trapped in its harbor. The next battle would be larger, louder, and bloodier, and at its heart, a man whose charge would make him a legend. By late June 1898, all eyes turned toward Santiago de Cuba, Spain's last fortress on the island. The city lay nestled between the mountains and the sea, protected by heavy artillery and the remnants of the Spanish Caribbean fleet. If Santiago fell, Cuba would fall with it, and the war would end. But between the American army and the city stood two hills, El Caney and San Juan, fortified by Spanish trenches and bristling with Mauser rifles. The ground that separated them would soon become a crucible of courage, chaos, and fire. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General William Shafter, numbered about $17,000, a mixture of regulars, volunteers, and veterans of the Indian Wars. Among them were the 9th and 10th Cavalry, regiments of black soldiers whose discipline and valor would prove decisive, though history would too often forget their names. Alongside them rode a flamboyant band of volunteers led by a future president, Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. They were a strange mix, Ivy League athletes, cowboys, miners, and policemen, united only by enthusiasm and inexperience. On July 1st, 1898, at dawn, the attack began. The Americans advanced through tall grass and jungle under a merciless sun, bullets snapping through the air like hornets. At El Caney, General Henry Lawton's men fought for hours to dislodge 500 Spaniards from a stone fort. Meanwhile, Shafter's main column moved toward San Juan Heights, where Roosevelt and his Rough Riders waited in the chaos, their horses left behind, their nerves taut. When the order to advance came, confusion reigned. The signal lines were cut. Commands were lost in the roar of gunfire. So Roosevelt did what instinct demanded. He stood up and charged. Waving his pistol, he led the Rough Riders forward across open ground swept by Spanish fire. "Follow me!" he shouted, and they did. Soldiers scrambled up the hill, stumbling, crawling, shouting, dying. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Beside them, the black cavalry regiments pushed forward in grim silence, trading volley for volley. For nearly 2 hours the battle raged. The Spanish defenders fought with remarkable tenacity, their Mausers cutting down wave after wave of attackers. But sheer momentum and overwhelming numbers carried the day. By early afternoon, Roosevelt and his men reached the crest of Kettle Hill, planting the American flag as cheers and gunfire mingled in the heat. To the east, other units seized San Juan Hill, completing the capture of the heights. From their new position, the Americans could look down upon Santiago, now within reach. The cost had been heavy. Nearly 1,000 American casualties littered the slopes. Bodies sprawled among torn grass and shattered earth. One soldier later wrote, "We took the hill, but the hill took us." For Roosevelt, the moment was both triumph and transformation. His reckless bravery, part courage, part showmanship, would make him a national hero and eventually a president. But beneath the heroics, the battle revealed something deeper. The United States, once a nation of farmers and merchants, had become a nation at war. The lessons learned on San Juan Hill, courage under fire, pride in conquest, the intoxicating power of victory, would echo far beyond Cuba. As night fell, the Spanish fleet still waited in Santiago's harbor, trapped like a wounded beast. The next morning, it would try to escape and meet its end in flames upon the sea. At dawn on July 3, 1898, the harbor of Santiago was quiet. The Spanish fleet, trapped for weeks beneath American guns, finally received its doomed order: break out and run for the open sea. Admiral Pascual Cervera, a weary man commanding weary ships, knew the truth. The attempt was suicide. His vessels were slow, outdated, and battered. The Americans, waiting outside the bay, were faster, armored, and eager. Yet pride demanded the attempt. "We shall die fighting," Cervera told his officers. "Better the bottom of the sea than surrender." At 9:35 a.m., the first Spanish cruiser, Infanta Maria Teresa, steamed out of the narrow channel. Behind it followed Vizcaya, Oquendo, and Cristobal Colon. American lookouts spotted the rising smoke, and in moments the calm sea erupted. From every direction, the U.S. warships opened fire: Iowa, Indiana, Texas, Brooklyn, Oregon, their guns thundering in unison. Shells screamed across the waves. Within minutes, Maria Teresa was ablaze, its decks a furnace. Oquendo followed, struck again and again until it ran aground. The battle became a rout. The Vizcaya attempted to flee westward, but was overtaken by the Oregon and Texas, its hull shattered by 13-inch shells. When its ammunition exploded, sailors dove overboard to escape the inferno. The last ship, Cristobal Colon, ran for the open ocean, chased relentlessly by the Brooklyn and Oregon. For nearly 2 hours it fled along the coast until, out of fuel and hope, its captain steered toward shore and surrendered. By noon, the Spanish Caribbean fleet, pride of an empire, was gone. Thousands of Spanish sailors were dead or captured. The Americans astonishingly lost only one man to combat. The contrast was staggering, a symbol of industrial might meeting imperial decay. As the wrecks burned along the Cuban coast, reporters cabled home the story that would dominate headlines: Spain's navy annihilated in a morning. In Havana, Madrid, and Washington, the meaning was unmistakable. Spain's empire had ended not in a great stand, but in smoke and silence. With the sea secured, General Shafter turned his attention to Santiago itself. Spanish troops, isolated and demoralized, held the city but could not be relieved. After days of bombardment and disease, they sought terms. On July 17th, Santiago surrendered. American troops marched through its streets to the sound of drums and church bells. Soldiers who had buried their friends on San Juan Hill now watched Spanish columns lay down their arms. A U.S. officer described the scene. They stacked their rifles, saluted their flag one last time, and wept. The surrender marked the end of Spain's rule in the Caribbean. Within days, the last Spanish forces on the island capitulated. The Stars and Stripes flew over Cuba's ports, while American soldiers raised it over Puerto Rico, taken almost without resistance. The war, barely 3 months old, was nearly won. Back in Washington, President McKinley received the news with quiet satisfaction. He had gambled his nation's peace on a war across 2 oceans, and won. But even in triumph, questions whispered through the corridors of power. What would become of the lands conquered in the name of liberation? Would America now keep what it had promised to free? For now, the guns were silent. The Empire of Spain had fallen, but the story of America's new empire was only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in the summer of 1898, the Spanish Empire, once ruler of half the world, was finished. From the Caribbean to the Pacific, the red and gold flag of Spain was lowered for the last time. Its colonies, held for centuries through blood and faith, were now bargaining chips on a diplomat's table. The war that had lasted just 4 months had accomplished what centuries of decline could not. It had broken an empire. In December 1898, representatives from Spain and the United States met in Paris to draft the terms of peace. The negotiation was swift, but its consequences would echo for generations. Spain agreed to relinquish its hold over Cuba, granting it nominal independence under American protection. Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded outright to the United States, spoils of war to be folded quietly into its growing sphere. The most controversial clause came last. For $20 million, Spain would sell the Philippines to the United States. The irony was heavy. America, which had gone to war proclaiming freedom for Cuba, now purchased another people's land as though trading property. When the Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898, the Old World exhaled. For Spain, it was humiliation, but also release. The loss of empire forced it to look inward, to rebuild from within. Across Europe, commentators mourned the fall of the once mighty Catholic realm. Across the Atlantic, Americans celebrated what many saw as divine destiny fulfilled. Bells rang in Washington, parades filled New York, and the press declared a new age of American greatness. But not everyone cheered. In Congress, fierce debates erupted. Critics asked whether the republic, founded on liberty and self-determination, had just become what it once despised. Senator George Hoar thundered, "You cannot govern a foreign people by force and call it freedom." The Anti-Imperialist League, led by voices like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and William Jennings Bryan, condemned the treaty as a betrayal of American principles. Twain wrote bitterly, "We have gone to wake the Filipinos up, not to free them, but to skin them." Yet their protests were drowned out by the chorus of victory. In Madrid, the mood was grim, but not hopeless. Spain's century of global ambition was over, but in its ashes, a new identity began to form, one rooted in art, philosophy, and introspection. The generation of '98, a circle of Spanish writers and thinkers, emerged from the ruins, asking what it meant to be Spanish after empire. For them, the defeat was not merely military, it was moral, spiritual, even existential. The cannons of Santiago and Manila had fired not just at ships and soldiers, but at the illusion of eternal empire itself. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was different, confident, expansive. America had stepped onto the world stage and found itself powerful. The map of its influence now stretched across oceans. From the Caribbean to the Pacific, the United States possessed ports, islands, and resources that would define its foreign policy for the next century. Spain's empire had collapsed. America's was just beginning to rise. Yet even as the ink dried on the treaty, far across the Pacific, in the jungles of Luzon, another kind of war was already brewing. Filipino revolutionaries who had fought to end Spanish rule now realized that a new flag and a new master had taken its place. The promise of liberty was once again deferred, and the cycle of rebellion was about to begin anew. The Treaty of Paris had ended one war, but it had also sown the seeds of another. Barely had the ink dried before the uneasy alliance between Americans and Filipinos unraveled into distrust, then hostility, then open bloodshed. What the United States called liberation had begun to look eerily like occupation. To the men who had fought under Emilio Aguinaldo's banner, it was a bitter realization. They had merely traded one empire for another. When U.S. troops marched through the streets of Manila in early 1899, they came not as guests but as masters. American commanders disarmed Filipino soldiers, occupied government buildings, and dismissed Aguinaldo's provisional republic as illegitimate. "We are not here to conquer," insisted Washington's spokesman, "but to protect." To many Filipinos, those words carried the familiar scent of colonial arrogance. The tension, thick as the tropical air, could not hold. On February 4th, 1899, a skirmish near the city's outskirts erupted into full-scale war. American sentries fired on Filipino soldiers crossing a bridge, and within hours, the island was ablaze again. The Philippine-American War had begun. What followed was a brutal, grinding conflict of ambushes, retribution, and guerrilla resistance. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, and civilians herded into camps. Scenes grimly reminiscent of the same Spanish tactics the U.S. had once condemned in Cuba. Mark Twain would later write, "There must be two Americas, one that sets the captive free and one that takes a once captive's place." At home, the glow of victory began to dim. Casualty lists lengthened. Letters from soldiers described the endless jungle war, the unbearable heat, the confusion of fighting people who had once been allies. Yet public pride, still swollen from triumph, refused to waver. The United States, many believed, had a duty to civilize the islands, a phrase that masked ambition behind the veil of virtue. Senators spoke of the white man's burden. Newspapers printed maps showing America's new possessions, colored in the patriotic red of empire. Still, the cost was undeniable. The war in the Philippines would drag on for 3 years, claiming more than 200,000 Filipino lives, soldiers, civilians, children. American losses were fewer but heavy with guilt and exhaustion. It was a far cry from the 4-month war of flags and glory that had captured the nation's imagination. The heroes of San Juan Hill were now replaced by weary soldiers fighting unseen enemies in foreign jungles. At home, the debate over empire split the country's conscience. The Anti-Imperialist League gathered signatures and held rallies, warning that America's moral soul was at stake. "You cannot govern another people and remain a republic," they declared. But the tide of history was moving the other way. The industrial economy, the steel navy, and the ambitions of politicians like Theodore Roosevelt had already pushed the United States onto the world stage. There was no turning back. By 1902, the war officially ended, though resistance lingered for years. Aguinaldo was captured, the Philippine Republic dissolved. Washington promised eventual self-rule, but under American oversight, a polite disguise for dominion. And while parades in New York and Washington celebrated victory, in the villages of Luzon, mothers still wept for their dead. The Spanish-American War had cost relatively little in time and blood, but its shadow stretched long across the Pacific into the 20th century and deep into the American psyche. For the first time, the United States had fought a war not for survival, but for influence. It had learned how intoxicating victory could be, and how easily ideals could be traded for power. The year 1898 ended not with peace, but with transformation. The United States, once a young republic content within its borders, had stepped into the 20th century as a global power. Its flag now flew over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Its navy patrolled 2 oceans. For the first time in history, America possessed overseas colonies, and with them came influence, pride, and a burden it barely understood. The Spanish-American War had lasted just 113 days, yet it changed the course of world history. For Spain, defeat marked both humiliation and rebirth. Its centuries of conquest were over, its colonies lost. But in losing empire, Spain rediscovered identity. The generation of '98, Poets, philosophers, and reformers emerged to question what Spain truly was without dominion. Their words sought renewal through art, faith, and reflection, not conquest. The once feared empire of conquistadors had become a nation of introspection. For the first time in centuries, Spain turned its gaze inward. Across the ocean, the United States was doing the opposite. It looked outward, toward Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific, with a newfound sense of destiny. The victory had ignited the imagination of its people. Newspapers spoke of the American century, of ships that would carry the flag to every shore. President William McKinley described it as a moral duty, that Providence itself had placed the islands of the sea into American hands to educate and uplift. Yet, even then, critics warned that the Republic, born in rebellion against empire, now risked becoming one. In the years that followed, American Marines would land in Havana, Manila, and Panama. Its businesses would stretch from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. The same generation that had freed Cuba would soon build the Panama Canal, annex Hawaii, and project power deeper into the Pacific. The modern United States, industrial, confident, global, had been forged not in revolution, but in expansion. And yet, beneath the parades and proclamations, something uneasy lingered. The war that had promised freedom had created dependencies. The empire that claimed to reject empires was now one itself, cloaked in the language of liberty. American soldiers had marched into the tropics carrying both rifles and ideals, only to discover that one was easier to keep polished than the other. In Havana Harbor, the rusting hull of the USS Maine remained half buried beneath the waves, a grave, a monument, and a warning. Around it, fishermen rowed quietly through the calm water that once burned with fire. They called the wreck La Cuna del Imperio, the cradle of the empire. From that silent grave rose the echoes of a new age, an age where America would no longer be a nation looking inward, but an empire stepping into the light of global power. For Spain, it was the end of a world. For America, it was the beginning of one.